restaurant with a dog who is constantly barking after just a few minutes of sitting down is, let's just say, not as relaxing as it could be. This episode of A Dog's Soul, an unpassed guide to your dog's feelings, is about a little dog named Baxter who would just do exactly that. Bark and bark and bark and bark whenever his mom sat down somewhere and couldn't even be quiet in a restaurant. So stay tuned and have fun. Alright, Baxter was a little French bulldog, and with French bulldogs, there is always the health concern. I know some people don't want to hear this, but this is a breed that has a lot of health issues, and whenever it comes to problem behavior, we have to take into consideration the stress level of our dogs, right? With any dog, any breed, any problem. And the stress level is very easily influenced by health issues. Again, in any dog and any breed. And a health issue can be as tiny as a blocked joint. It can be as huge as a broken leg. It can be anything. And since health issues are so stressful for our dogs, breeds who have trouble breathing because they are just built that way always have a higher stress level in that department. And that's what we have to take into consideration when working with them, when training them, and when we are looking at problem behavior. So what Baxter did was, whenever they sat down, he would just be very impatient. He was like a little child who wasn't getting any attention, and dad started pulling on mom's clothes, calling, "Mommy, mommy, mommy." Baxter was kind of the same thing. He wouldn't tug on her clothes, but he would start barking. At first it was just a little whine, it was becoming more and more annoying until it was a full-blown bark. And of course you can't sit in a restaurant and have a nice dinner or whatever meal in a relaxed way, or chat with a friend over coffee or whatever if your dog is constantly barking. So this was something that his mom wanted to resolve as quickly as possible, even though it's not something that she would have called a huge problem, because she could just have let him stay home alone. But she wanted to have the freedom of taking him with her because he was, other than that, a pretty easygoing dog. He didn't have any issues with people, he didn't have any issues in the city, so it was just that and a little bit of leisure activity. It kind of always comes up in my consultations. It's always a little bit of leisure activity, but then again, that's what I'm specialized in, so maybe that's the reason. Or maybe because it's a really, really common problem. So if your dog is leash reactive, don't worry, you're not alone. But for Baxter, it wasn't like he was only barking at other dogs. He was barking specifically at mom. He would sit next to her and bark up at her. And when we looked at the stress level, of course the breathing came up, but it wasn't bad enough so that he could have an operation. Something about the insurance. I'm not quite sure about how the whole insurance thing works, and I'm not willing to educate myself on that. But anyway, he wasn't ready for an operation yet. So that was one thing we had to live with. And sometimes we just have to live with stresses that we find in our dogs' lives, right? So if we find something we have to live with, we have to resolve everything else as best as we can so that the overall levels are lower. And for him, he was doing too much during the day. His mom was taking him everywhere with her, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if sleep and rest comes up short because of it, it's an issue. So we switched around some things, and his mom watched out for giving him enough sleep and rest during the day, which was already influencing how his leash reactivity was going, and it almost resolved itself. The leash reactivity itself was an issue, of course, because it's stressful for the dog, even if it doesn't look like it, but it's stressful. And then we had a little bit of how they were communicating with each other. Baxter was sometimes just a little over the top, and his mom got annoyed, and then they started a little bit of a fight, not physical or anything, but she would tell him no and get louder every single time she told him no, and he kept going and kept going and kept going. This happened every other day, so mostly in the evenings, which is again a sign of stress, right? So this was one thing. There were some little things like putting a harness on instead of a collar and really letting him put his head through and not just overwhelming him with stuffing him in there. We added a jacket he wore outside because French bulldogs don't really have that much of an undercoat, and it was pretty cold where he lived. And we switched the exercise from things he could chase to things he could search for. So more nose work and less chasing. And sometimes that feels counterintuitive, right? Because those dogs seem to have so much energy, and people try to drain that energy with exercises that involve a lot of movement and a lot of fast movement. But what those exercises do is they push the stress level. They release stress hormones to make the dog able to perform at his or her highest levels. It's adrenaline. It's what we know in sports, and it's something that has to be taken care of after every arousing exercise, let's just call it that, which is forgotten a lot. And when stress levels are already high, we don't need to add another stress hormone release. So this is something that again had a huge impact on how Baxter was acting on leash and toward other dogs. He was way more relaxed. He had to learn to sniff because again, for short-snouted dogs, it's sometimes a little bit tricky to get into that. But he learned very quickly and he was having fun with it. So he just needed a little bit of a push. And that was all awesome, and he became a lot more relaxed in day-to-day life. It didn't resolve the restaurant issue, however. He was calmer, but he still was very impatient. So what we did was we introduced a relaxation zone. I would have done that anyway. I do that with every dog because it's just something that every dog needs, in my opinion. It's a spot in the house where your dog can feel absolutely safe, where he knows relaxation happens either by himself or with you, and it's also somewhere the dog can hide if necessary. So nobody's bothering him in there, which is super important in my opinion. We introduced this relaxation zone with a portable blanket in there so we can take something somewhere else, right? Which is also very often really handy, especially if you want to take your dog to restaurants or hotels or in the car, things like that. And it's introduced very quickly. So Baxter learned that super fast, and then we started taking that blanket to different areas, different spots, and just introduced relaxation in those new areas. Of course, it had to be done indoors because it's cold out, but it worked pretty well. And then we started taking that blanket into the restaurant. And in the beginning, Baxter still needed a little bit of help, so he needed something to chew or lick in this area, because in a restaurant a lot is going on sometimes, right? His mom always picked the quietest area to sit down, but there is waiters coming to your table and people talking and the door closing and opening and other dogs coming in and all those things. So it's not that easy to relax in a spot like this. That's why Baxter needed a little bit of help in the beginning. But he learned pretty quickly again, and soon after they started taking that blanket with them, it was no longer an issue. Most of the time. Again, sometimes we don't get 100%, which is okay because our dogs can have a bad day as well as we can. And this is something that's just natural. In those days, they either didn't go have a meal in a restaurant, or what they also worked on was Baxter being fine when mom was standing or sitting still. And that was just something that took a lot of treats in the beginning. So a very high reward density. So he was getting rewards very frequently. And during training, it became less and less and less. Again, this is something that we can add if we have a very impatient dog, to just let him learn that good things are happening when he's waiting. And in the beginning, it's just a second. It's very, very fast and it's very easy. So we don't want our dogs to make any mistakes in training, right? Because we don't want to wait for the dog to make a mistake and then correct him. It's just a trap and it's not really fair. We want our dogs to have success with the right behavior. We want them to practice what we want to see. And for that, we have to set them up with situations they can actually handle. And for Baxter, it was just walking, stopping for just a moment, giving him a treat, walking. Walking, sitting down, giving him a treat, walking again. And doing this quite often, he was getting practice and practice and practice in being quiet while standing or sitting, whatever he did, doesn't matter. And because they practiced this so much, they could make these stops longer and longer and longer pretty quickly. Because this is something you can practice like in a lot of repetitions. How often can you stop on a walk? An infinite number of times. That's why this is so quick, right? Because we get so much practice in. Alright, and that was all Baxter needed. Stress reduction, something that told him it's time to relax, that was the blanket, and a little bit of patience. And sometimes that's all it takes. Now, I would love to know if this is an issue your dog is dealing with. Is your dog impatient, or is your dog just fine whenever you stop and sit down or go to a restaurant? Tell me in the comments or via email if you want. And don't forget to rate and review the show or like and subscribe, because that way even more people can find this little nugget of training and help their dogs get through life in a more relaxed way together with their humans. I wish you a lot of fun training, and we'll see each other next time. Bye!